Welcome. In this video, we're going to begin working with the command line. Before we get started though, we should go over a couple of basic terms. A few terms that help us understand the command line better are operating system, Unix and Linux, disk operating systems or DOS, application, shell, graphical user interface, command line interface, bash, console, and the command line. Let's go ahead and define each of these. An operating system is software that supports the core functionality of a computer, peripherals, and applications. You may be familiar with an operating system like Mac OS, or an operating system like Android that might run on a phone. The next terms are Unix and Linux. Unix is an operating system that was premium or paid that later evolved into Linux, which was licensed under GNU for free. Linux today runs by default on all Macs and on many web servers processing websites. We also have the term disk operating system or DOS, which refers to a group of operating systems, most primarily MS-DOS for Windows, which used to be one of the primary engines running behind Windows. Windows has changed this system over time into more of a server architecture, and the nice thing is today is that Windows can actually support us running Linux commands in the command line on a Windows machine. You can see the link in the video notes to read more about this if you're working on a Windows. The term application is quite simple. It's simply a program designed to perform a specific set of related tasks. The important thing to note, though, is that applications run on operating systems or OSs. So we need to be able to tell the difference between an operating system and an application. Then we have shells. Shells are user interfaces for both operating systems and for applications. In general, there are two types of shells, GUIs and CLIs. GUIs, or graphical user interfaces, allow someone to interact with an app or an OS using peripherals and a well-designed interface. The Apple operating system would be an example of this, and an app like Photoshop or even Atom are also examples of this. The graphical user interface is one type of shell that we have on our computers, and the command line interface, or CLI, is the other. A CLI is a text input-output interface, or what we could call an interloper, for an operating system or an application. So whereas a graphical user interface, or GUI, would allow us to use our mouse and an app on a monitor, the command line interface is simply going to allow us to type text to communicate with an application or directly with our operating system. This brings us to the term bash, or Bourne-Again shell. This is the most common shell, or CLI, for Linux. It's default on Macs, and it's probably what you're going to be using most of the time. However, later in the course, we'll look at other shell options like ZHS, which can serve as an alternative for the bash CLI. Next, we have the term console. A console is a text-only application that provides CLI access. Examples of these would be terminal and iTerm. So when we use the command line, we're usually using a console, but what we're typing and what we're interacting with is actually a bash or a shell that lets us do command line interactions. However, these terms often get lumped together and used together, although it is important to understand the slight technical differences. So with all of these terms covered, it brings us finally to talking about the command line. This is a generic term for CLI commands used to interact with the OS, apps, or smaller scripts and tools that we'll look at as part of our JavaScript developer toolset. The term command line often also refers to using an app like Terminal in general for interacting with a CLI or the command line. So now that we've covered all these terms, let's go ahead and open up our app Terminal and take a look at what we see. When I open up Terminal, the first thing we see here is what's referred to as the command prompt. The command prompt displays before the command line input where we'll be typing in our actual commands. It includes the name of the computer, the username, and possibly much more. The final thing to point out about the command prompt is that it is highly customizable. And while we won't customize it too much in this video, we will look in future videos at how to do that. I've also included some links in the video notes here if you want to take a stab at jumping ahead with this. So if I come back into Terminal here, we can see that I have the name of my computer, which is Mac, and then my username, which is Zac Gordon. It's possible to change both of these things. The easiest one to change, though, is your computer name. If I open up my System Preferences and go under Sharing, you could see your computer name listed right here. So I'm using a Mac and I have it listed as a Mac. I also like having a short name. You might see something like listed like this. And then if you were to save this simply by just clicking out of that field, closing down and opening up a new terminal, or I'm just going to open a new tab, you'll then see something like Zac's MacBook Pro, a much longer name. However, because this command prompt is always displayed, I'd suggest, unless you have a reason to, or when you're doing local development, that you change this to something shorter. MacBook Pro, or I'm just going to call it Mac. Now, changing the username portion of this is a little bit more complicated and involves backing up the main folders of your Apple computer. So for that reason, I'm not going to go over that now, but I do include the links in the video notes if you want to take a stab at that yourself. It's something that is pretty well documented. However, for now, that's as customizable as we'll get with the prompt itself. But what this prompt is geared to tell you, the computer you're working on, the username, and then what we'll find out more of as we go on is that it will also tell us the folder that we are currently in, or the path to the folder where we are. So we'll see more of that as we go forward. But now let's talk about what's going to go in the actual command line area here that we'll type in. Luckily, when it comes to typing in commands into the command line, there is a pretty basic syntax. And this syntax only involves really three parts. It involves the commands, which are usually a single word, options, and different commands will have a number of different options available to it for customizing it, tweaking it. And then finally, parameters. And parameters are further pieces of information that are passed to the options or to the command itself to give it more details and have it do exactly what it is that you want it to do. So all three of these are pretty common, and the way to write these out is pretty simple as well. So by default, when you are working in the command line, you would first type whatever the command is itself. Again, this is usually a single word. Followed by that, you may have a number of different options. And there's a long format of typing out option names, which looks like this with 2 dashes and then the option name. But then there's also a shorthand method of writing out options, which involves a single dash and then usually just the first letter. And it depends on what you're working with, how those abbreviations, but in general, this is a general principle that works. The other thing that you could do is using the shorten method is you could often combine options together. So you'll see this format sometimes where you'll have a command followed by a dash followed by a number of letters, and each of these letters represents a different option. Finally, if you're passing any parameters to that option or to the command, those will come here as well. So if you've been working in WordPress development or development in general for a while, you've probably had to work with the command line at some point, and I've seen things like these, but now we have the basic working syntax of command, options, shorthanded options, and parameters and how they all work. The one extra thing I want to mention here, though, is that there are some times when we're working with certain tools that we'll see a structure that looks a little bit more like this, where we have a tool, a command, and then our options and parameters. So, for example, when we're working with Git, we might have something like git commit, and then our options, followed by the actual parameter of what the message is that we want to commit. Now, the tool here is actually also a command. I'm just specifying the word tool here because most often it will be the name of whatever tool it is that comes first. So if we're working with something like Git, we type git and then the command, or if we're working with something like npm, which we'll look at shortly, then we type npm and then the command. Later on, when we're working with different tools, we might type webpack and then the command, etc., etc. So you may also see this format as well pretty commonly. So at this point, you shouldn't have too much review to do. If you're not familiar with the terms that we've covered, you want to go back over them one more time just to make sure you understand terms like console, bash, shell, things like that, a CLI versus a GUI. However, if you know these terms and are comfortable moving on, then in the next video, we'll begin really getting into typing some of the basic commands and learning how to navigate using terminal and do a few other things like that. So once you know the terms, go ahead and jump into the next video, Command Line Basics.